Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at Wilson. I am truly honored to be introducing today's panel. 1 year after Mahsa Amini's death, the impact of female protests in Iran. A very important milestone in a country that faces many challenges and whose young girls and women have inspired all of us to stand up, speak up, and fight peacefully for equal rights. We at the Middle East program have been at the forefront of not only documenting developments across the region on women's rights, women in leadership, female labor participation, and gender-based violence, but have also taken deep dives to research, analyze, and better understand the challenges, the opportunities, and mark the progress where there is progress all across the MENA region. Under the Middle East Women's Initiative, we launched a blog entitled Anaduana, who is the first penned author from Mesopotamia. Anaduana presents and amplifies voices of women from across the MENA region. We also published 2 flagship reports, one on public leadership in the MENA region and a most recent one on entrepreneurship. And today we present Women Lead a Year of Trial and Protest, Reflections from the Middle East Women's Initiative to mark the first anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death. Distinguished fellow and founder of the Middle East program, Halia Esfandiari, contributed numerous analyses, offered nuanced insights that delved into this burgeoning movement in its early days. And also, we have other reactions from other fellows from the Middle East program, including Marina Ottaway. This publication represents the most timely and engaging discussion of events stemming from Amini's death. And now I would like to turn to our panel and panelists. I'd like to first introduce our esteemed moderator, who is a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center, but we also get to share Robin Wright with USIP. Thank you so much, Robin, for your time and for leading the discussion today with your expertise and insight, particularly with the Iran primer, and I will leave the details of the Iran primer to you to talk about. On the panel are also MEP Distinguished Fellow and founder of MEP Halia Esfandiari, who has been a mentor to all of us here at the Middle East program. Ali Vaez, who's Senior Advisor to the President and Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, Henry Rome, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And before I hand the floor over to you, Robin, just a note to our online audience to submit questions in the comments box and under the video player, or to tweet at us at Wilson Center MEP. And with that, Robin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm honored to be doing this panel today. Iran is a subject near and dear to my heart. In 3 weeks, I will mark 50 years having covered Iran. My first trip as a young reporter was in 1973. So I've witnessed a lot and been lucky to do so. I'm honored to share the stage with 3 of my very favorite analysts. We're going to try to do something broader today. There are a lot of events in town this week. Barbara Slavin did a good one yesterday at the Stimson Center. We're going to try to take a kind of longer view, wider view, looking at kind of the trends, what's happened in the past year, but also what the trajectory is for the long term. What it means and where is it headed, to try to give you some context a year in. We all know the basics, that thousands were arrested, more than 500 were killed, thousands have been sentenced to long prison terms, 7 have been executed. We've seen a very tumultuous year and a hardcore regime crack down on its people with a widening array of tools. I'm a journalist, so I speak in headlines. And I'm going to try to set the stage and then turn it over to a conversation with my 3 colleagues with 8 headlines. The first is that for the first time in human history, we've seen women be both the spark and the engine of whether you view it as a revolution or a counter-revolution. Who would have thought in the 21st century that hair and scarves would be the tool of a major political movement? It's stunning in many ways. The world has taken notice and has been inspired. So far, we've seen the protests over the last year play out basically in two phases. The first was over the last 3 months of 2022, when the issue went from wearing hijab after the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody over the issue of dress, and quickly expanded to include challenges to the system, challenges to its leadership, and specifically the supreme leader. Then there was the sequel, which was sparked by the poisoning of girls. The numbers there are kind of staggering. 7,000 were poisoned during the first 3.5 months of this year at schools in 28 of Iran's 31 provinces. But what's really interesting about the past year is that it comes in context of 6 years of accelerating protests, both in terms of the pace and the pattern. Very quickly, to kind of give you a timeline, the first, that started this round, this escalating round of opposition, was started in December 2017 and ran into early 2018, originally over the price of poultry and eggs. As we often see, economic issues have sparked an incredible array of reactions. And again, as usual, they spread to more fundamental issues of the economic failures of the regime and then challenges to the system of government itself. Then we saw, within a year, in November 2019, protests that were ignited by a sudden, abrupt, unannounced hike in the price of fuel by as much as 300%, and a new rationing system. And once again, as the pattern has been, they grew quickly to challenges to the regime itself. Those protests swept 100 cities in just 4 days. Then in January 2020, Iranians launched anti-government protests after the IRGC admitted that it had shot down a Ukrainian aircraft, killing all 176 people on board. The Iranians originally denied having any role, and once they had to confess that they did, people took to the streets and started chanting, down with the regime, down with the liars. And then we, of course, get to 2022, the Mahsa Amini protests and the poisoning. So it's really important to understand the pace. What's happening? There's a bigger trend line to the story. The bottom line is that regime, beware. This is a trajectory that we should all take note of and understand last year in context of the last 6 years. So my second bottom line is an amazing irony, really, and this is right to the kind of work Marissa is doing. Iran's revolutionaries planted the seeds of their own unraveling at the hands of girls, too. Before the revolution, literacy among young females was only 28%, roughly just over 1 out of every 4 females, partly because traditional families didn't trust a rapidly modernizing government to protect their girls in middle and higher education. They were afraid of being exposed to miniskirts and makeup and Western mores. And so in varying degrees, they allowed their children, some of the girls, to go to elementary school, others were homeschooled. But the reality was that literacy, even though it made an improvement in the last years of the monarchy, that literacy was still restricted to a smaller number. But after the revolution, traditional families believed that an Islamic system would protect their girls, and more girls went to school. So by 1998, 2 decades after the revolution, female literacy, once 28%, had soared to 80%. The United Nations gave Iran its highest award for closing the gender gap in education. By 2021, female literacy among girls 15 to 24, and we're talking about the girls who were active, literacy among females was 99%, according to the World Bank. So for more than a decade now, the majority of Iranian university students have been female, at a time that their employment or involvement in the labor force is somewhere around 20%. So you educate your girls, you give them a sense of being involved or knowing enough to be involved, to run, being allowed to run for parliament, have a female vice president and so forth, but you limit the avenues of their integration in society, and so you give them a cause. So you create an active generation, and then you prevent them from participating, and that, of course, contributed enormously. So as I said, my bottom line here is that there is now no going back. You do not uneducate people who have access to the world in a globalizing world. So my third headline is that demographics actually played a huge role, and in a kind of weird way. And this is important in understanding both how we got to today, but also what lies ahead. After the revolution, the regime called on women to breed an Islamic generation, and boy, did they. They lowered the age of marriage to 9 for girls and 14 for boys. By 1986, just 7 years after the revolution, the average family had 6 children. Iran's population doubled within a decade. But, well, the clerics said that they wanted to breed an Islamic generation as the soul, the number, the heart, the result of the revolution, to protect the revolution. But in many ways, just the opposite has happened. But anyway, after a decade, the clerics realized, whoops, we can't feed, clothe, house, educate, employ those numbers, and they are going to become voters. The revolutionaries actually originally lowered the voting age to 16. So it instituted a family planning program where everything was free: condom, Norplan, IUD, tubal ligation, vasectomy, to lower the birth rate. And they did. Within another decade or so, the birth rate came down to 1.8, or replacement at 2 children per family. But they created a baby boom, and this is really incredible. These are the parents of the activists. By 4 decades after the revolution, we're now 44 years, the population has grown by almost 50 million people, and the number of households has quadrupled. And that's important in understanding that people have expectations. And the very generation that the regime wanted to breed to protect the future of the revolution, it can no longer provide for. And so the regime becomes, again, vulnerable by its own making. Iran is struggling, as we know, from the economic protests to provide for the majority. And that baby boom generation now constitutes over half the population, and more importantly, over half the voters. Now, again, the third generation, which are born between 1997 and 2012, are the Gen Z, or what we call the Zoomers. And they are the children. They are not as wedded to the system. Their parents grew up in the revolution, during a war, during the turmoil, during isolation, and still accepted the social compromise. The government would take care of them if they bought into the system to whatever degree. Their kids, educated, connected, are not interested. They're more pragmatic and personal in their goals, but they only constitute 13% of the population. And the reality of the demographics is that the kids who are getting out there, launching protests, putting their lives on the line and so forth, need their parents. Their grandparents, not so much, but their parents, that baby boom generation. And what we witnessed is that some turned out, but we didn't get to the critical mass that would give a movement led by kids the kind of momentum and durability to sustain. Just one interesting little factoid from the Iran primer. In 2010, and we're talking 13 years ago, only 16% of Iran's population used the internet. In 2020, 3 years ago, 84% of Iran's population was connected to the internet and through social media. So the bottom line is that the Zoomers, the protest generation, simply don't yet, and I emphasize yet, have the kind of critical mass to confront the regime in a way that will break the system and create a viable political alternative. My fourth headline is that there's a tough reality that was also reflected in the Arab uprisings of 2011 and 2012. During the Arab uprising, the young were inexperienced politically. They didn't have a unifying leader, an organizational structure, or a common agenda, basically a plan. They knew what they were against, but not necessarily how to create an alternative. Meanwhile, the flip side of that is that political theory teaches that an autocrat needs only 30% of a population in order to survive, to man the security forces, to run the bureaucracy, to help run the economy. That's why the likes of the Assad dynasty could survive through 11 years of civil war. You have 30% of the state, 30% of the population that can kind of administer, however inefficiently or ineffectively, the state. And of course, in Iran, the regime has far more tools to repress the protesters. So again, this is a long game when we look at kind of the future. My fifth headline is that revolutions and utopian ideologies tend to collapse when a confluence of factors, you need more than one of these things, and usually most of them, to lead to the collapse of a regime. Political alienation is one. Economic crises is a second. The third is the failure of the social contract. And the fourth are those kind of wild card natural disasters, unexpected events. To apply that to Iran today, a year after the protests, after 6 years of increasing protests, the majority of Iranians didn't vote for the first time in a presidential election that put Raisi to power in 2021. That tells us something about public mood, restlessness, alienation, what is public thinking. Economically, U.S. sanctions have tanked Iran's currency. When I first went to Iran in 1973, one U.S. dollar was worth 70 riyals. In recent years, we've seen it go as high as 600,000 riyals to the dollar. Sanctions have deeply affected Iran's oil revenues. There are some estimates, I think last year, that they lost $450 billion. $450 billion in oil revenues because of sanctions. So, and then socially, the Islamic Republic has failed to provide for its people. And finally, in terms of wildcard disasters, you had COVID, where Iran was an epicenter, and 60,000 Iranians died. There was a lot of deep bitterness over the failure of its program. The sixth headline is that the core issue in Iran for 44 years, in its foreign policy, in its domestic policy, in every action it takes, is one core question. Is the Islamic Republic of Iran first and foremost Islamic, where God's laws are supreme and the clerics have the last word? Or is it a republic where man's law, where the electorate decides and elected officials have the last word on the state's actions? The irony of all this, of course, is that Iran, ancient Persia, is widely credited with the first great act of human rights when Cyrus freed the Jews of Babylon and other minorities, when he said that power comes only when conferred by the people. And today, 25 centuries later, the protests in Iran were a brazen rejection of the supreme leader, and the theocracy's belief that God's law supersedes human laws. The tragedy is also that Iran's modern leaders have, unlike Cyrus, marginalized minorities and ethnic groups and critics and taken away issues of human rights. So the bottom line is the central question remains on the table. What is Iran? What is the Islamic Republic? And is it a viable formula for a modern state? My seventh, and I promise to be brief in these last two, the Islamic Republic has repeatedly surprised the world. It survived an 8-year war. It survived the isolation from various hostage crises, both in Iran and Lebanon. It survived sanctions, many layers. It built its own NATO-like alliance from scratch that is linked to the deaths of thousands of America. It rebuilt a military. It now has the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East, and it is, if it makes the political decision, and that's a big if, on the cusp of being able to produce, to become the world's 10th nuclear power. So the bottom line there is that the regime does seem more brittle than at any time in 44 years, especially as a leadership transition looms, with the supreme leader having turned 84 and not being completely well. He turned 84 in July. But we also shouldn't underestimate the current regime's assets. We need to be clear-headed and not get confusing wishful thinking with the kind of strategic realities of this regime. And finally, I just want to say a word on the hostage deal that apparently looms sometime in the next week. I think we all need to be, there's already a lot of kind of lopsided or simplistic reporting on what it involves. The swap, we believe, involves 5 Americans or Iranian Americans being released by Tehran, and the United States releasing 5 Iranians imprisoned here. The terms mean that the United States will issue a waiver, so South Korea, which has had $6 billion in oil revenues for a long time, they couldn't return to Iran for the fear the United States would sanction South Korea. But the assets will all come under the control of Qatar. Iran will not see a penny of that money or have control. It can apply for the use of that $6 billion for humanitarian purposes, which have always been allowed under U.S. sanctions. Medical, educational, humanitarian issues have always been allowed under sanctions. But the United States has veto power. If Iran proposes acquisition of one commodity, then the United States can say no. Qatar will control all the assets. So anyway, I want to turn it over to the panel now, having tried to set the scenes. Hale, I'll begin with you, a former hostage in Iran, someone who knows as much about the protest movement in Iran as anyone else. What is the state of the protest movement today? What is its ability to continue? Has a leadership coalesced? Is there a sense of direction, a plan? What's happened in the last year, and what does it mean for the next year?
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you for all of you to be here. Before answering your question, I would like to thank the Middle East program, Marissa, and her colleagues, and who are also my colleagues, our colleagues, for putting this meeting together. They worked very hard on this meeting and on the publication. And Robin, as always, it's a pleasure to be with you on a panel. And I must confess that I owe a lot to Robin. She worked when I was in jail. She diligently worked to get me out of there. And every time I read about one of the hostages, I think I wish they had a Robin too, who would do what you did for me. Now, back to more serious thing. I think the movement, I think the movement is not dead. It's not even dormant. It is there to stay, because my sense and of what goes on in Iran today, and talking to relatives and friends of the younger generation, I feel that they have not given up despite all the repression of the government, the arrest, as you mentioned, the killing, and so on. These women are not giving up. I mean, they are not going to go back to the hijab. The hijab has become irrelevant for them, really, because, you know, they wear it if they feel like, they don't wear it if they don't feel like. But for them, there are some very fundamental issues for this younger generation. They want to be able to live like the other Gen Zs around the world. They see that. They are connected. You gave figures. They are the best connected people in Iran are the younger people. Just to give you an example, I was talking to a cousin the other night, just wanting to see what was going on. She said, "Aren't you watching the US Open?" I said, "I didn't even know there was the US Open tonight." She said, "Yes, I'll talk to you tomorrow because I want to watch it." An hour later, she sent me a text. She said, "We lost the internet. Can you please text me who won?" So, making me text my daughter saying, "Please watch it to tell me who won the US Open." So that is the level of connection, you know, of the younger generation, and as you mentioned, the baby boomers, their parents, you know. But their parents are more conservative, while this younger generation is fearless and not conservative at all. They really would like just to live under a different system. They really are sick and tired of what they have gone under for the last 20 years, 22 years, you know. And the government, rather than opening up, is shutting down more and more, you know. I mean, you mentioned the level of education of these women. They are educated, therefore they know what goes on in the rest of the world. The government has decided to purge the best and the brightest among the academic across the country in universities. They are now coming with the absurd idea of segregating once again their classes. There was a circular sent to the University of Mashhad, to the Faculty for Engineering. Segregation of classes should start. They don't have enough professors to segregate classes. So what will happen? Once again, the girl will sit in the back. I saw that when I visited one of the universities in Iran, and the men in the front, and they talk to each other. You can't shut them up. They talk to each other, they walk out, they mix and mingle. You know, so we are back, in a way, the mentality of the government is going back to the early days of the revolution when it comes to the young people, while these young people are already in the 22nd century. They're not going to put up.
So one question, what are you seeing in a tangible way beyond women not wearing hijab, beyond, you know, shouting slogans against the clerics, against the system? Is there more, are there other ways of expressing disillusionment or anger or rejection?
Robin, the only way to express their anger and rejection is to come out in the street. And now, when there is a demonstration, the women join them immediately. And it doesn't matter what it is. The other day, a group of retirees went out and demonstrated because their salaries were not paid, you know, in Marijuana, I think. Women joined them. So my sense is that as soon as there is a demonstration somewhere, if it is not instigated by by the women, they will join them and they will continue to join them. And I think the resistance against this oppression will continue for a while.
So Ali, let me turn to you and let's look at the state of the regime a year later. What's your sense of, you know, not just the kind of repression it's engaging in, but how is it surviving? What do you see? I mean, is there any kind of debate about how to deal with the protests? Where are we politically? Especially, and I'll follow up then with a question about the election that looms ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Robin and Marissa, for having me here at the Wilson Center. It's great to be back and on this illustrious panel with my colleagues. You know, Robin, it's interesting because when you look at the regime in its rhetoric, it exudes confidence. It has survived what it describes as a multifaceted hybrid war orchestrated by its foreign foes. And in addition to that, it has managed to mend ties with some of its regional rivals. It has joined some international multilateral groups. It has basically managed to partially recover from the deep isolation it suffered last year, not only because of its brutal crackdown, but also because of its complicity in Russia's aggression in Ukraine. But when I see the regime's behavior, I see lack of confidence. Because now in the run-up to the anniversary of Mahsa's murder, you see that they have preemptively disrupted the internet, arrested activists, even families of people who were killed or injured last year. They have muzzled the media. They've fired dozens of academics. And this is, again, the behavior of a regime that is masking structural weaknesses that Hala was talking about, and you mentioned as well. But I want to make three broad points, since you said we were going to have a more of a general overview of the situation about the arc of Iran's history, which is long but doesn't seem to be bending towards justice. First is that the Islamic Republic's modus operandi over the past 4 decades in general has leaned towards exclusionary politics. If you look from the beginning of the revolution, it has gradually eliminated a lot of the original revolutionaries, Jacobins of the 1979, and the circle of insiders has continued to shrink and shrink. If you look at major shocks in Iran during the past 4 decades, whether they emanate from external sources like the Iraq's invasion of Iran in 1980, or Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018, or whether they had internal sources like the 2009 Green Movement or 2022 Women, Life, Freedom Movement, I would argue that they have all catalyzed a shift of the center of the Iranian politics to the right, and in the process have also militarized and securitized the system. So there have been, of course, fluctuations, and at times the system has done some course correction, but the overall trend is towards becoming more right-wing and militarized. Now, because I believe that the regime is unwilling or unable to address the underlying grievances that have led to these increasing protests that you're talking about, 3 major protests in the course of 6 years, and it cannot sustainably resolve its problems with the outside world, it is going to continue to face internal and external shocks, which means that this pattern will continue. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that I believe the system is no longer really interested in course corrections. So in 2009, for instance, after the Green Movement, I think also amid the Arab uprisings, Ayatollah Khamenei realized that the system could be in danger and allowed a much more pluralistic election in 2013. Not an open one, of course, but it was slightly more pluralistic, which led to Rouhani's victory. I think that era is behind us, and this is one of the outcomes of last year's protest. It is also a function of Ayatollah Khamenei's age. I think it's much less flexible at this point. But I would argue that the regime has given up on the majority of the Iranian people, who in turn have given up on the regime. This is really the outcome of last year's elections, and last year's protests. The regime's constituency, according to internal polls, is around 15% of the citizenry. 85% of Iranian people, again, based on internal surveys, say they're unsatisfied with the status quo. And the system's Republican bodies and the institution of elections have been emptied out of any meaning. Even key reformist figures no longer believe in meaningful evolutionary change. Former Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, one of the leaders of the Green Movement, who's under house arrest since 2011, and always wanted to work within the framework of the Islamic Republic's constitution, now says we have to move beyond it, and there is a need for a constitutional referendum. And there are a lot of other reformists who've joined based on this message. My third point is that all of this is happening with the Supreme Leader's succession looming large. And I would argue a system that is much more right-wing and militarized and doesn't even care about preserving the facade of a participatory system is, in fact, has already become a militarized Islamic state. It's no longer a republic, really. And that's why I would argue that Ayatollah Khamenei is probably the last supreme leader of Iran, in the sense that we might have another supreme leader, but he would no longer be supreme. That the real power behind the veil is going to be the military. And in that sense, Iran's political system, I think, would resemble something between Pakistan and Egypt, with the distinguishing factor there being whether they have nuclear weapons or not. I'll end with just this point on the fact that this is a very bleak picture, of course, but it doesn't mean that there will be no longer any chances for the people of Iran to try to change the direction. And it also doesn't mean that politics in Iran will become meaningless. In the run-up to the elections that I'm sure you were going to talk about next March, I think we will see a lot of competition between neoconservatives and ultra-conservatives. It's a small group, but there will be real competition for control. But even insiders like Ali Larijani, former Speaker of the Parliament, a hardcore conservative who's been sidelined, has talked about purification or purging in the system. And again, I think the reason there is because the system doesn't want to have any surprises in the transition to the next supreme leader. And this purging is not just limited to the political sphere. You even see it in academics, for instance. It really appears that there is another cultural revolution, by firing academics and putting pressure on celebrities and artists. So the regime might come out of all of this looking victorious, but I would argue it's a Pyrrhic victory, and it has come at the cost of its legitimacy and identity.
Yeah, is it a short-term victory? The revolutions, when you study revolutions, as I've done for one of my books, they always remind me like onions. You peel away layers until you get to the core. And we've thought repeatedly, with Khatami, maybe it was becoming the normal state, as Crane Britton, explains in his classic work on revolutions. And then we get an Ahmadinejad, and then we get a Rouhani, and so forth. But with each one, you see the hardliners grabbing more and more of the power. And, when taking your scenario one step further, what does this mean if the military controls the state? What does this mean for politics at home? What does it mean for relations with the world and its ability, even as it's mending relations, it's also, becoming, whether it's 83.6% of enriched uranium or, confronting the U.S. ships in the Gulf, you can feel there is kind of an more aggressive, self-assured presence by the military.
So it's hard to say because the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, is not monolithic. and it all depends on which figures within the IRGC will be the most prominent ones. And the office of the current Supreme Leader really likes to be able to preserve its own influence and power. And so in that sense, it could be a combination of some of the people who already are influential in the office of Ayatollah Khamenei and have a military background, and they would bring to power more people of their own ilk. And you already see it in the Raisi administration, by the way. His Minister of Interior is the original founder of Hezbollah, the original founder of the Quds Force, the man who was behind all of these crackdowns last year. A truly scary character.
His name for those who might not know.
Ahmad Vahidi. So it all depends, but we see more and more governors being of the Revolutionary Guard's background, even local officials. So it's really, they're taking over the entire system. But in some sense, the military could be a little bit more pragmatic than 85-year-old clerics or the original generation of the revolutionaries who are in their 80s and 90s. The head of the Assembly of Experts is 95, the head of the Guardian Council, and the main point I want to make is the military, of course, is primarily looks at the world from a threat perception perspective, right? And I fear that given the proximity that they have to nuclear weapons, which is the ultimate deterrent, if Ayatollah Khamenei is not there anymore, it will be so much more difficult to convince Iran to abandon this project and not to cross the Rubicon and develop nuclear weapons. So the ticking bomb is not just Iran's nuclear advancements, but it's also, how much longer is Ayatollah Khamenei around? Because it will be more difficult to do this with the military. But in some areas, I've sensed more pragmatism. For instance, a senior security official from an IRGC background told me just in the beginning of the protest last year that it's really bizarre that the clerical establishment is sticking to this idea of mandatory hijab. You look at communist China. At some point, they wanted every Chinese to be a member of the Communist Party, but later on they became more pragmatic. The revolution normalized, made its peace with the world, and then they only asked for people who serve the government to be members of the party. And maybe we should do the same thing. Maybe only women who serve in the government should wear hijab, and everybody else could have a choice. Meaning that in some areas you might see a military that is more pragmatic than the clerics, but in some other areas, I think it would be more problematic to deal with.
Fascinating. Okay, Henry, let me turn to you. I want to know about the state of the economy, because when we look at this pattern of protests, more of them were over economic issues than over kind of personal freedoms. They grew into bigger issues of the political system, but they originated over the economic issues that affect everybody in Iran, and all three generations. And I came across some figures that were really interesting because, of course, the goal has been to try to isolate Iran's ability to trade with the world. So a report a couple of days ago claimed that Iran now exports 2.2 million barrels a day, and its budget is only based on 1.3 barrels a day. In 2020, Iran's oil revenues hit $8 billion. The next year, 2021, oil revenues passed $25 billion. And last year, oil revenues surpassed $42 billion, more than 5 times what it was just 2 years before that. So is this, even though it's, Iran has to give discounts and kind of smuggle and figure out ways around U.S. sanctions, does this give the regime a kind of open-ended cushion? And secondly, how important are these economic flashpoints in determining what's going to happen next?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Robin. Thanks to the Wilson Center and the really great panel discussion so far. I'll make 3 kind of big points to try to answer your question here and looking at the state of the economy. The first is that it's better than it was last year. Second, still big challenges ahead, and those improvements that we might have seen over the past year not being felt by many Iranians. And the third is that there are still really significant vulnerabilities in the system that are, we see the cracks, and I think it's really important to take a moment to think about how things could go in different directions. So first, on the fact that things have been looking better this year compared to last year. The government has a lot of things it can point to and that it has pointed to on the positive direction. Inflation has come down. The economy is growing. Oil and non-oil exports have risen. Unemployment has fallen. And their efforts to stabilize the rial after a very volatile few years have worked somewhat. And I think we can point to a few reasons for this. One is greater oil exports, which Robin mentioned, and I'll touch on briefly. The second, the kind of post-COVID recovery in the non-oil sector, so that's manufacturing, services, which comprise the majority of the Iranian economy. And also some effective policy choices from the government side, although oftentimes implemented chaotically and in a way that further erodes whatever trust there is in the government to make smart decisions. So on the oil, just to dwell on that for a bit. So more oil revenue is not a get out of jail free card, but it is very important, and it's important to this broader story. Just to give you two kind of numbers for context. Oil accounts for about a third of Iranian exports and about a quarter of government revenue. So it's not as big as actually a country like Saudi Arabia, which relies very heavily on oil. But that slice in Iran is extremely important to allow it to import what it needs from the outside and give it access to hard currency. And since the end of 2020, oil exports have tripled to it's now about, on average, about 1.5 million barrels per day. Sustainably, and that's a big number, and that's a number short about 1 million from the maximum, but still a sizable amount of exports. And I think the really key driver here is that U.S. policy has created a kind of permissive environment where countries like China, and almost exclusively China, have continued to increase their imports of Iranian oil. And I think the message, with some exceptions, but the broader message from the U.S. for the past few years now has been that the risk of buying or moving Iranian oil is less than it was. And I think this has economic effects, as Robin pointed to, and it also has political effects too, of showing that a deal may not be as necessary as it once was, if living without a deal can be somewhat profitable. But on the second point, on the challenges, let's not get too carried away here. There's really ample areas where economic grievance can lead to unrest. Annual inflation is 40%. Now that, the U.S. dealt with about 9% last year, and I think everybody in this room and watching has a newfound appreciation for what inflation is and how it can actually affect day-to-day life. Iran's been running at 40% for quite a while now, and that has an eroding effect on households, on businesses, and that's not something to, even though it kind of has been staying there or even coming down a bit, that's still a pretty sizable number. There's long-term kind of weaknesses in the banking system, in the pension system that Hale brought up earlier, protests about retirees not being able to get their pensions. Unemployment, I mentioned, has fallen, but that's because a lot of people have stopped looking for work, and this is especially the case for women. And the latest government estimates are that about a third of Iranians live in poverty. And I think one data point just to zoom in on is the price of meat. And Robin mentioned this as a factor in protests going back 6 years ago. It was also a key episode during the Ahmadinejad administration where an increase in the price of chicken led to significant protests. The price of meat in Iran has doubled over the past year. And there doesn't seem to be much effort to try to constrain those price rises. So I'm not going to predict protests, but I think that's something to just keep in mind when you think about potential economic triggers to unrest. And I think the third point to highlight are the vulnerabilities, the things that aren't acute issues that come across everyone's desk on a day-to-day basis, but are things that could pose risks in the future. And things that really shouldn't, that Iranian leaders should not feel comfortable about. The first is a real heavy concentration of the international relationships from an economic point of view. 90+% of Iran's oil goes to China. 1/3 of its non-oil exports go to China. And in terms of what Iran imports from the world, 2/3 of it comes from 3 countries: China, the UAE, and Turkey. That is a huge concentration of power especially for China. And the risk that is often talked about here is that the Chinese could use that economic weight for political or geopolitical purposes, which I think the Chinese have not done to this date. It's possible they will, though I think there are reasons to doubt that. But there's also risks, even if there's no kind of political motivation to it, given the risks of the what we're seeing now, a slowdown in the Chinese economy. If that were to accelerate more, you can see very clearly draw a line from developments in China to impacts on Iran, which is so heavily reliant on the Chinese. So I think it's particularly interesting for a country like Iran, which has self-reliance kind of built into its DNA, to be so heavily weighted economically on that relationship. And I think there are internal vulnerabilities as well, just looking at it from the economic perspective. For example, the kind of same internet that Ali mentioned that has been interrupted once again over the past few days, the same internet that the authorities see as a dangerous kind of spreading of ideas, supports millions of jobs and billions of dollars of commerce. That during last fall's protests, there were a stat that the Tehran Chamber of Commerce threw out that 700,000 digital businesses in Iran that are affected by internet shutdowns. That's a big number. That's a lot of people. And that could easily, and I think the government recognizes this, and they've tried to have been a bit more clever in how they adjust the internet. But you can easily draw a picture of a scenario where a kind of repressive response leads to big economic consequences, which feeds on itself. And then the final point, which is really important to just mention here, and Ali actually wrote a very interesting paper about this in Khuzestan, is the vulnerability to climate and to drought, extreme temperatures, effects on the agriculture sector. And that's an issue that the government has done very little to try to address, and that again can have big economic consequences as well. So that was my initial take. Thank you.
So let me follow up with that. Iran is so dependent on its oil exports for the majority of its foreign exchange. I mean, one of the things we for those of us who track the economy, the infrastructure is old, dilapidated, held, paper clips and bubble gum in some cases, kind of like their Air Force. It's decades behind in developing the gas fields that it shares with Qatar. It relies on foreign refineries. So again, short term, it's survived all expectations, defied U.S. sanctions. But long term, how vulnerable is it? Because that also indicates how vulnerable the system is in sustaining itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right way to think about it. If you kind of fast forward the tape here 10 to 20 years, what you're looking at, let's just zoom in on oil and gas because we've been talking about that. Again, Iran not as reliant as a country like Saudi Arabia is on oil, but it is essential to the functioning of the economy. The government has been trying to adapt in various ways, trying to prioritize where it invests the kind of limited resources. But when you look at these big issues like the energy transition, the shifts away from fossil fuels, the kind of more creative approaches and heavy investments in renewable energies, these are things that countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE are spending enormous sums on in developing this technology and diversifying their economies. And it's just easy to see how far behind Iran is today and how that gap will just continue growing over time as its neighbors and sometimes rivals lap it as they advance. And just to be clear, the nuclear program is not the energy transition plan that the Iranians have. They essentially don't have one. And I think just in general, I mentioned the pension system, climate change. These are aspects that the government really does not have sustainable solutions to. And so it's really kind of stagnating in important ways and being left behind as the real shape of the global economy and the energy picture shifts.
Fascinating. You're also, I always learn from you guys. You're wonderful. Let me go back and start with Hale. I'm going to do another round of questions, and then I'll open it to the audience here. We have a small audience. Thank you for coming. And we have about 250, I think, online. Let me ask Hale, because this potential hostage exchange is apparently imminent, why do you think the regime is doing it now? Does it have anything to do with President Raisi coming to the United Nations General Assembly next week? Is it because because of the economic need? I mean, what are the factors that have led the government to do this? And, I mean, I've covered every hostage crisis. I covered it when the Americans in Iran in 1979, 81. I stood at the foot of the steps of the plane in Algiers when they flew to freedom. You know, I had friends when I was based in Beirut who were picked up and held, Terry Anderson, for 7 years, and, you know, the list goes on and on. So, and Hale, my dear friend, and Siamak Namazi, a dear friend too. Does this indicate that the trend is over, or is this just, you know, the end of this round and it's going to remain an integral part of Iran's tactics?
Robin, the reason why it happened now is that this is the result of 2 years of discussion between the American, and I really would like to give a lot of credit to Robert Malley, who took this business very seriously and was constantly discussing the release of the hostages. But there were difficulties, and they couldn't reach an agreement. We reached a point where Mr. Raisi wants to is coming next week, and he knew that in his press conferences and meeting with American journalists, think tanker, the first question will be, when are you releasing our hostages and why are you keeping them? I mean, Siamak Namazi lost 8 years of his life, the best time of his life, sitting in Evin, you know. So I think, and they really wanted these 6 billion to go maybe to Doha so they can release the money they had set aside for spending on what they think now the money from Doha can purchase for them. So I think it had 3 reasons. One was that Raisi didn't want to confront this sort of question. Just Ahmadinejad, they released me before, if you remember, before he came to Washington, because the previous year he was asked about me. So he didn't want to once again answer this question. Secondly, I think it's the monetary thing. And thirdly, the monetary issue. They need those 6 billion, you know. And thirdly, I think they want to distract the people in Iran who are now focusing on the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death. That is my take.
So, Ali, you brought up the nuclear issue, and I personally kind of think that we are so close on the cusp that the odds grow that whether certain military people have their say or the supreme leader dies, or whatever. But when you talk to the U.S. military, the thing that worries them less than about nuclear weapons is its missile arsenal, its drones, which it now sells to globally. I mean, Venezuela and Sudan and Ethiopia, and it's provided its proxies and so forth. What kind of military threat, or is there a wag the dog theory of protests start again? I mean, to what degree, given the military's stronger role, stronger presence in the economy and politics across the board, how much do you have a sense that that how far is Iran willing to go on that front generally? We all agree that, whether it's the kind of Shiite mentality of feeling you're a minority and under threat, your survival at stake. Persia's history, that, it's ethnically it's a minority, all those facts. We understand its perspective, but how much, given, if there are protests, does it do things to exert itself, wag the dog, and so forth? Just talk to, what's your sense of using the tools it has, and what you think the biggest dangers are, and how would that ever intersect with what's going on at home?
Sure. So let me just add one thing on the detainee deal. There have been instances that the Iranians have been ready to do the deal over the past 2.5 years, and the U.S. has not been ready. So it's not that they have fine-tuned this exact moment, but I would say both sides knew that this is the last opportunity to get a deal because, as of this fall, we're in full electoral mode here, and the Iranians knew a deal would no longer be possible. And I think the Biden administration also knew that the cost will be significantly higher going forward, and so this was the last opportunity, really. And I want to say that it came, in a way, these two issues of nuclear negotiations and detainee negotiations were linked because, for instance, the reason these funds were included in the negotiations is not because the U.S. was considering giving Iran ransom at all. Iran was going to get access to all of these assets anyways as part of a nuclear deal, right? So all the U.S. had promised was facilitating access because primary banks don't want to work with Iran. Even with Treasury Department's green light, they're reluctant to work with Iran. And that's why it's taking 6 weeks to do the transfer of $6 billion to Iran. Otherwise, it could have happened in a matter of days. I think the administration, if it had the power to make it happen in a matter of days, it would. But this is really a lesson in limitations of U.S. sanctions, that even the Treasury Department itself cannot get what it wants when it wants effective sanctions relief. But yeah, so that's what I want to add to the detainee negotiations. On the military side, look, the reality is, I think for two reasons, Ayatollah Khamenei has been reluctant to take the last step towards militarization of the nuclear program. One is that he knows it will go through a conflict, that this program is so deeply penetrated by Western and Israeli intelligence that there is no way that they would make even the decision, not the action, but even the decision to cross the Rubicon that would not be detected and would not trigger military action. So, and he's a cautious man. People who served in the Iran-Iraq war, were involved in it, are much more pragmatic in terms of costs of war than is the case of some of the newer generation in the IRGC. And second reason is that he knows that once Iran actually becomes not a virtual nuclear weapon state, but a real nuclear weapon state, it would trigger a domino effect, and it would basically, Iran would be outpaced by countries in the region that have much more resources to get engaged in this kind of nuclear arms race. And Iran would lose a lot of its own inherent strategic benefits if the game turns into a nuclear weapons game. Once he's not there, I'm not sure if the military would share that assessment, because there are people within the military who also believe that the cost of a military confrontation is a short-term setback for the program that they could recover from, and it actually helps because it creates a rally around the flag effect. And in other words, because the U.S. is not going to do what it did in Iraq or Afghanistan, it's going to be a surgical strike. The program recovers and the regime recovers. So it's the definition of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And it's in their interest because, of course, as a military, it would allow them to militarize the internal sphere even more. On the conventional side, this is the one area in which the Islamic Republic, with all of its limitations, has done pretty well. You look at the economy, you look at society, culturally, on every level they have failed. But when it gets to the two main areas of their defensive policy, the forward defense policy of hiring a network of partners and proxies throughout the region to project power beyond their borders, has served the purpose. And the second is their asymmetric means of defense, be it their ballistic missiles, their drones, their submarines and speedboats and all of that. They have created a situation in which I remember you did an interview, I think, with General McKenzie, talked about overmatch. Exactly. That that the U.S. no longer has the upper hand in the skies because of Iranian drones and missiles. And of course, we've seen spectacular attacks on Saudi Aramco facility and U.S. military bases. And the military is very proud of this. They see it in a very different light than the rest of us. Like, for someone like me, who's the child of the revolution and grew up during the Iran-Iraq war, it's really terrible when you see that Iran is doing to Ukraine what a lot of the regional countries did to Iran by providing weapons to the aggressor. But Islamic Republic is doing this. And the military is proud of it because it says a military power like Russia is now coming and asking us for our technology, right? And so I think they will continue, but also they will continue on this path because there is no viable alternative to it in terms of the strategic options, right? I know it's blasphemy to say it in this town, but when Iran talks about buying Su-35s from Russia or S-400s from Russia, everybody in this town gets really traumatized by the prospect of Iran having conventional weapons. Conventional weapons are what the U.S. can't take out. That's not a problem. It's the unconventional weapons and asymmetric means that are much more difficult to deal with. But once they don't have the option of going down the route that every other country can go by purchasing conventional weapons, they double down on the policies that are problematic from our perspective and the perspective of their regional neighbors.
Great. So, Henry, let me, you did an interesting paper on the nuclear law, but I wanted to talk, kind of take you in a slightly different direction. Iran has made major diplomatic strides this year in de-escalating tensions with Saudi Arabia and also joining BRICS, and which is part of, I think one of the most interesting developments is the role of the global south now. And I think we kind of lose sight of these bigger issues, long-term issues, challenging the dollar, very disparate systems, governments, but they've come together like the non-aligned movement, but arguably with more power this time. But what does this mean for Iran's place in the world? And how does it, again, make them help them kind of encountering the protests at home and giving them a sense that they have a bigger place or legitimacy in the world, which it can use then in arguing, you see, we've accomplished something.
Yeah, I think there's been a really remarkable dichotomy between Iran's external environment especially over the past few months, but going back a year, seems to continue to improve. And its internal environment, as typified by the protests one year ago and by some of the economic trends I discussed earlier, remains quite fraught. And I think the government has been trying to find ways to convert this kind of positive momentum externally into dividends internally. And I think just looking externally, I think the remarkable thing is that despite arming Russia, and very clear, there's no doubt that that's what's happening here. And despite a very public and globally broadcast crackdown at home, Iran now, I would argue, is less isolated than it was a year ago. It's with different parties. But from a political point of view, the deal with Saudi Arabia, BRICS, you said, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these are goals that the Iranians have long held out, especially in the case of the kind of big multilateral organizations, and that the Raisi administration can claim that it is finally reaping this, despite Western efforts to isolate it. And I think also, if you look at many European states which had responded quite forcefully to the protests and the provision of drones, I think the Iranian leadership, looking at Europe's posture, it's kind of a dynamic of everything has changed, but nothing has changed. There's still an attitude towards trying to revive what came close to coming to fruition last year in terms of JCPOA. And so I think the dynamics here are quite fascinating. But I do want to add a footnote to all this, because a lot of what we're talking about, the SCO, the deal with Saudi Arabia, BRICS, these are political accomplishments, but really can't expect much economically to come from them anytime soon. These are organizations, in the case of the SCO, which is primarily a security type organization, BRICS, which because of U.S. sanctions, Iran remains locked out of the BRICS Bank, so-called BRICS Bank. And the deal with Saudi Arabia, the Saudis have been clear that this is not going to lead to Saudi Arabia violating U.S. sanctions in pursuit of kind of an economic peace with Iran. So I think the Iranians have been broadcasting domestically that these deals are as important, if not more important than JCPOA, that they were able to achieve these goals without a deal and without adhering to the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which sets global banking transparency standards. But I think you do have to add that nuance, that actually in terms of real dollars and cents, this doesn't get them a whole lot.
Great, wonderful. I'm now willing to open the floor to anyone here who has a question. Barbara Slavin usually has one to begin, so I'll let her, and then David Ottaway after that, and then third.
Thank you, Robin. I didn't even have to put up my hand.
We know you, Barbara.
Yeah. Thank you very much also for the kind remarks about our event yesterday. I think between yesterday and today, my brain is full, frankly. I wanted to ask Henry, though, a little bit more about the push for de-dollarization. We are seeing, obviously, the Chinese are able to sell more and more oil priced in yuan, and the Saudis made an interesting threat. We wrote about it on our blog, Middle East Voices, not long ago. Back in January, one of the Saudi officials suggested that Saudi Arabia might start to price oil contracts not in dollars. Now, the writer of this blog thought this was just a threat to get the U.S. to do some various other things the Saudis want, like nuclear technology, security guarantees, and so on. But how do you see it? Is there a real shift going on in terms of the price of oil, how oil is sold? And should we be worried about that?
Sure. So, I think it's a really important issue to deal with here, and it's something that a lot of critics of U.S. sanctions policy have put forward as kind of a long-term threat here, in terms of driving countries away from using the dollar. I would say this is right now not a kind of any kind of imminent risk. I think we're talking very long time horizon due to the fact that even if many countries and governments do not agree with how the U.S. Approaches its sanctions policy or its broader economic policy, not just related to sanctions, the alternatives aren't very good. The renminbi is not a freely convertible currency that has the same characteristics of a kind of an open, predictable government in the U.S. And so there are these kind of flirtations with it. There are calls from the BRICS group to try to trade more in local currencies. These things could evolve over time, but I think we're talking a very long time horizon. Things that are not going to be of any help to economic planners in Iran today or in the next few years. So I think it's perhaps a hope among parties that are subject to these sanctions and these restrictions. And it is a political tool, but I think the risks are quite far down the line. We haven't really seen a credible competitor to the dollar emerge.
Before we get to David, I want to take one online question because it's from the president of the State Department press corps, and I know the briefing is soon, and so I want him to get his answers. It's from Sean Tandon from AFP. He asks, and I'll let Ali address this one, what, if any, are the lasting effects of the Mahsa Amini protests on U.S. policy? Despite the prisoner deal, is it now even more politically undesirable for the Biden administration to negotiate anything of substance with Iran?
I would argue last year it had that impact that really rendered engagement with Iran completely toxic for the administration. Remember, it's around the same time that there was also more revelations about Iran's provision of drones to Russia. And so the combination of those two factors, of a regime that is seen as responsible for killing its own people on the streets and indirectly killing Ukrainians, it was very toxic, not just for the Biden administration, but also for the Europeans. But at the end of the day, this was a murderous regime in 2015 as well. It was a murderous regime in 2003 when the nuclear negotiations started as well. And the fact that the nature of the regime is such, a regime that has blinded hundreds of protesters with rubber bullets, cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons. It's as simple as that. And so the Biden administration or any other U.S. government, if they don't want Iran to have the most dangerous weapons out there, have no option other than engagement. And the only thing in the past 20 years of a nuclear standoff with Iran that has rolled back the program is diplomacy. Pressure, threats, credible military threat, all of that has never had the impact of rolling back the program or freezing it. It has always and only been diplomacy.
So the flip side of that question, I guess, is does the hostage swap then make it easier for the Biden administration to engage with Iran on diplomacy because they did manage to achieve something?
Yeah, so my sense is that we're likely to see resumption of nuclear negotiations in the next few weeks, with even direct U.S.-Iran negotiations formally, no longer proximity talks. This could happen on the sidelines of UNGA in New York next week, or could happen later in October after we jump over the theatrics over the sunsets of UN Resolution 2231 that happens in mid-October. But I think we will see resumption of talks. But I'm very cynical about these talks actually producing anything. I think it will be mostly a process, but it wouldn't necessarily result in a deal because obviously the Biden administration in an election year doesn't want to offer Iran significant sanctions relief for some of the same reasons we discussed. And Iranians also, I doubt, really want to give away their leverage not knowing who the next U.S. president is going to be.
And because there are 48,000 candidates have already registered for the parliamentary elections in Iran, and they don't want talks with the United States to be an issue in its own election. Okay, David.
This has been a really interesting discussion, I must say. Congratulations. At the beginning of the protests last year, there were signs that the oil workers went on strike. I think the bazaar closed down for a couple of days. There were indications of other sectors of the country and the economy supporting the protests. What's happened to the bazaar? And is there any opposition from that quarter? And any sign of coalition of groups coming together and working together amongst the opponents of the regime?
David, no sign, at least I don't see, nor do I hear, that there is an official coalition of various groups coming together, because, I mean, that is what the regime is looking for. The regime has been trying to figure out who are the leaders, if there are any, to go after them. But what we have seen is that every time, there is a demonstration, you see people from different walk of life joining them. For example, it was very interesting to see that this a few days ago, when in the city of Marivan, I think the retirees were demonstrating, there were also women who joined them. Or when the women were demonstrating, the workers in oil refineries went on strike for a day, not more, or some shops closed. I think this is going to continue to be the pattern, that there will not be, I don't read it this way, there will not be a homogeneous group of people coming out. Like, for example, during the second election of Ahmadinejad, when 1 million people came out and said, "Where is my vote?" This is not going to be the case because, as Ali mentioned, the regime that blinds its people, that shoots the people, that takes 20,000 people, young people are sitting in jail, 500 are killed. So they won't take pity at their fellow countrymen. But nevertheless, when there is a protest, you see the number will be more than what it was last year. That's how I see it.
So let me just add one thing. I think I've been to Iran more than anyone who's not a dual national since the revolution. And every time I go, I always go down to Parliament. And I've never been there when there wasn't a demonstration. Sometimes there are 30 people, sometimes 200. They're griping over teachers who haven't been paid in 3 months. I mean, they're always small. Iranians are very active, energetic when it comes to, their economic demands, their well-being, their survival. I mean, it's unlike anything I've seen in other parts of the Middle East, with the exception of Israel. And I'm always inspired, but I think when you mentioned the oil workers, I think it was and I think I'm right on this, it was just the contractors it was not permanent staff. In other words, those people who are part-time employees, or, their permanent jobs are not on the line. The regime is used very effectively, held job security over an awful lot of people and their relatives as a means. And so the intimidation has, I think, kind of tamp down the numbers willing to put that on the line. But it is true. One protest often leads to others kind of joining in, but there's a real lack of cohesion. And I think that's one of the, the factors we have to look at when understanding, what's the future. I think we all, there was a lot of speculation when the protest started that this was the beginning of the end and the revolution or counter-revolution was alive. And that, unfortunately, whatever people's preferences are, that's not what happened. So I'll take one last question. We're running out of time. I thank everybody.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for such a fascinating talk, for such a distinguished panel. My question is, Khali Wes sort of talked about this at the start, about like the increasing militarization of the Iranian system. My question is, what implications do you think this will have on Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and specifically like the recent like Saudi-Iran normalization deal? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
I can take a stab at it. Look, interestingly, when Iran and Saudi Arabia engaged in direct talks hosted by the Iraqis in 2021, the Saudis didn't want to talk to Iranian diplomats. They wanted to talk to Iranian security and military officials because they knew that those are the people that matter in the region. And the talks were led by the current Iranian ambassador at the UN, Saeed Iravani, who was Deputy National Security Advisor with a security background. And then basically the man who finalized the deal was National Security Advisor, a former commander of the Revolutionary Guards. Again, completely dominated by the military. There was one individual as representing the Foreign Ministry, but the majority of the delegation were of that background. And it's because the Saudis, the Emiratis, everybody else, they understand where the power lies, especially when it gets to Iran's regional policy. If you look at Iranian ambassadors in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, now increasingly in the Caucasus, they're all from the IRGC, or they come from an IRGC background. And it's all, again, because it's the IRGC that is running the show. And I wanted to also respond to David's question that in many ways there is no longer a bazaar in the traditional sense that it existed. The bazaar is the IRGC as well.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Marissa for organizing this event. Very timely, very thoughtful, different from what others have done. I thank Sweet Holly, my colleague and friend of many years, Ali and Henry, who are incredible analysts. Thank you all for for your in-depth, thoughtful analysis and giving a sense of what happens next. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and next time.